Annie Hartnett holds degrees from the MFA program at the University of Alabama, Middlebury College Breadloaf School of English, and from Hamilton College. She's received fellowships from the MacDowell Colony, Sewanee Writers Conference, and the Associates of the Boston Public Library. She teaches courses on the novel and the short story in both Boston and Providence. She is the author of the novels Rabbit Cake and Unlikely Animals. The delightfully inventive, tragicomic, Unlikely Animals tells the story of Emma Starling, who returns reluctantly to her small New Hampshire hometown, having misplaced her gift for hands-on healing. At home, there are high hopes that she can reverse or at least halt the progress of her father's mysterious brain disease that has him hallucinating cats and creating chaos wherever he goes. The talking ghosts, I love this part, in Maple Street Cemetery are omniscient, but only within town lines. And Emma needs to find some useful occupation, forgive her father for his affair, find her lost best friend, the entrepreneurial Crystal Nash, and somehow help her brother continue to recover from opioid addiction. It's a full docket. Annie told me this morning that on Goodreads, someone wrote, you know, this book is like the show Chopped, in that people are required to use both tuna and chocolate in a recipe, and somehow it works. So, without further ado, Annie Hartnett.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you. Can you hear me? No, is that good? Thank you so much, Stephanie. Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming out this morning. I'm so happy to be here in Brattleboro. This is where I would live if I didn't have to live where I live. So yeah, thanks for that. That was a really good introduction. This book is this is my second book, and this one is a lot harder to describe, in part because I wanted to do, the first book is like a straight first person voicey narration, and so much of that book is just about the voice of that character, and you just love her and follow her wherever you go, wherever she goes, and in some ways the plot doesn't matter as much in that book. So for my second book, I wanted to do something different, and so this one I wanted to write one with a more like intricate plot where everything that happens influences something later that happens. And I know John Irving was here he was here digitally. And so I was really inspired by John Irving's plots where he puts something in and you think, oh, this is just a thing that doesn't have to do with anything. It's just kind of a fun scene. And then later it's like the key to the whole climax. So that was part of my inspiration of trying to write a book that has a lot in it. And I will tell you more about how the book came to be, because after I read a little, but the things that you do need to know is that it is based in a real New Hampshire town, Newport, New Hampshire. It's inspired by that town, and there is a 26,000 acre hunting preserve that was created by a Gilded Age millionaire in 1886 that's still there today. That I became obsessed with. And so the book was really inspired by that, because I was writing a book that was about a woman with a slight magical healing touch who comes home to a small town because her father is dying of a mysterious brain disease, and the family has hopes that she can heal him, but she has just dropped out of med school because her healing touch is no longer working. And so she's come home to try to take care of her father, knowing that there's nothing she can do for him. And so I don't usually read the first chapter, but I'm going to read the first chapter, especially since Allison's book is awesome. I know Allison, she lives in Providence. But unfortunately she can't be here today. So now I'm going to take up a little more time. I do love attention. So I'm going to read you two scenes, and I'll read you the first section. There is a prologue that I'm going to skip where you find out that she has a magic healing touch. So Oh, and then the other thing you need to know is that, so the father is hallucinating animals, and he is hallucinating small animals. He has walked into his classroom. There's cats in his classroom, so he gets asked politely to leave because it's a little chaotic to teach college poetry if you believe that there's dozens of cats in your classroom. So the family knows about that, but the family also knows that he is experiencing what they think is a hallucination, but it's the ghost of Ernest Harold Baines, who was a real-life naturalist who lived in this at the edge of this park in New Hampshire from 1904 to his death in 1925, and he was a real-life Dr. Dolittle. So in the second part that I read, that's important. And yeah, it's narrated by the ghosts in the cemetery. So sometimes they will speak up, but you'll be able to tell. There's like a Greek chorus going on. You'll be able to tell when they're talking. All right, so chapter 1. Emma Starling didn't come into Everton the way that took her by Maple Street Cemetery, so she didn't hold her breath when she drove by us, like she used to on the school bus as a kid. She didn't drive by the town square either, so she missed the celebratory sight when the 4 men and 2 teenage boys finally caught the wild boar. Emma hadn't seen the way they whooped and slapped each other on the back. Boars aren't native to New Hampshire, but here in Everton, they often dig out underneath the electric fence to escape the private hunting park that spans the Upper Valley. The park is enormous, 26,000 acres, fenced in about 135 years ago by the 19th century robber baron Austin Corbin as his grand retirement project. He bought up the land from farmers and shipped in animals from all over the world. The Corbin family went bankrupt. I never read the first chapter, so I can't look up at you guys, I guess. The Corbin family went bankrupt after the World Wars, and today the park is owned by a small club of anonymous millionaires, each member with their own hunting cabin. These millionaires tend to keep to themselves unless a boar gets out when park headquarters puts out a call to catch the pig, a $1,000 reward. Shit, Emma said, her anxiety mounting as she drove. I can't believe I'm back here. Even though Emma didn't drive by us in the cemetery, we could hear her muttering to herself. We could see that she had an enormous white dog in the backseat of her red rental car. We were beginning to hear some of her thoughts. We see and hear it all in Everton, one of the perks of being dead, omniscience within town limits. It's a little frustrating how the living come and go, but we always get the full story eventually. Emma's story was trickling out of her now. We learned it wasn't a triumphant return for the 22-year-old redheaded medical school student who was wearing a nice enough gray sweater, but had rips in the knees of her jeans that her mother would never approve of. It seemed things had gone all wrong in California, but right now she was mostly thinking about what she was driving into. Her father's new doctor said he couldn't be sure exactly what the disease was until an autopsy, which was definitely out of the question as long as Clive remained alive. But it was causing tremors, confusion, and extremely vivid hallucinations. Today, he says he's seen a ghost, Emma's mother had complained on the phone. She'd sighed. Dr. Wheeler says a year, 2 at the best. How can this doctor say it'll be a year when he doesn't know what disease it is? Emma asked. It is not the time to outsmart everyone, Emma. It can be a little tiring. Just come home. I know your brother would like to see you too. Emma knew there was no way Augie gave one single flying fart about whether she ever came home or not, but she knew it was time to come home anyway. And you need to forgive your father before he dies, her mother had reminded her. Otherwise, that guilt would eat you from the inside out. Okay, Mom, Emma had said, and the phone call was pretty much over after that. Her mother had followed up with an email, had given it the subject line, "Things to talk about with your father." But Emma hadn't bothered to read it. She was angry that her mother had let her dad back in the house after only 2 months of sleeping under his desk in the Merited College English department building. Emma would have left him there at least a few months more, but her father got away with everything. The man is dying, she reminded herself as she drove. Have some sympathy. The big white dog in the back seat sniffed at the top of the window, wondering if Emma could please crack it a little to let some smells in. We learned then that Emma had picked up the dog only a half hour before. When she had turned onto the Route 10 exit towards Everton, the dog had been trotting along, no owner in sight, no collar, matted fur. Emma loved dogs, but she would have stopped the rental car for anyone if she meant she could delay her arrival. She would have stopped for a hitchhiker, a possible serial killer. When Emma pulled the car over, the dog had hopped right back in the back seat. He was super duper glad to see her, nothing close to a killer. She named the dog Moses after that famous orphan and savior because Emma felt like she needed a savior right then. Moses put his head between the seats and rested his chin on her bony shoulder. Emma had always been small. She was pale with freckles. A 7 out of 10, according to Jesse Peters, born 1984, died 2013, one of our graveyard residents who considered himself an armchair expert on the ladies. You're going to live in the palace, Emma told Moses, even if that was not exactly how she felt about her childhood home. But her parents' house was definitely a good place to be a dog. Her mother's last rescue dog had died that summer, cancer, and she had recently said that she had a dog-shaped hole in her heart, even though her husband was also dying. Moses went to swipe the side of Emma's cheek with his tongue, and a drool loogie fell from his jowls and stuck to Emma's sweater, which was extremely gross, but Emma's heart warmed. Good boy, she said. Friend, Moses was thinking at that moment. We like that about dogs. We always had, how clearly they can show a person exactly what they're thinking. We spend most of our times focused on the thoughts of the human beings of our town, but sometimes it's good to be absorbed in the thoughts of a dog. Emma drove past the sign advertising some snowmobile rentals. Kids under 5 ride free. So many people don't know how redneck New Hampshire really is, Emma thought, which hurt our feelings a little. We had hoped she would be glad to be back after so much time away. We had hoped that when she'd seen the traffic of Los Angeles, she could have appreciated our town's charm. Because Everton is really a nice place to live, or it was for us. Other than the enormous private hunting park, Everton is more or less a normal New Hampshire town. There are pine trees and winding roads and blue-green mountains. Sugar River snakes through the town, dotted with covered bridges, and the water is clean enough to swim and fish in. We're particularly proud of Maple Street Cemetery, which is surrounded by a neat stone wall, a large iron gate, and is well maintained by our groundskeeper, the one-handed Mr. Ridley Willett, an Army vet. It's really a town no different from any other, a place where people live and people die. But now, maybe now, Emma Starling was coming back home to Everton, things could be different. Just this once, maybe someone could cheat death, edge the Grim Reaper out by a nose. We weren't naive at Maple Street. We knew about the limits of Emma's abilities after her years of adolescent healing attempts. Her days sitting in the sticky red booth at the McDonald's with Crystal Nash, the girls charging $45 cash for a half hour of real deal teenage healing. Crystal was the business manager. The entire operation had been her idea. Crystal used to insist that with Emma's power, she should be like Jesus. But Emma wasn't exactly Jesus. Emma had trouble getting close to people, and Jesus, well, that dude was charismatic. Jesus must have been a hell of a guy. Not many people can say they came back from the dead. The rest of us stay here when we go. But Emma didn't have to be Jesus. You don't have to be Jesus to want to save your dad from what's killing him. And at least by now, the time of her return to Everton, Emma was older, more mature. The charm should have grown stronger, so maybe she could heal her father, extend his lifeline by a little. We didn't want Clive to live forever. We just wanted a little more time tacked on at the end. Extra time would mean something for anyone, and especially for a man like Clive, who still had some things to work out with his family. Don't hold your breath for a miracle, Charles Tepper, born 1932, died 1998, said from his seat on his grave, since he didn't believe Clive's condition was curable. A bunch of us laughed. Funny, since none of us breathe anyway. What about mothers who lift cars off babies? Maybelle Hennick, born 1799, died 1820, argued from her headstone. Anything could happen, Charles. You know that. Maybelle had died before the invention of the automobile, but at Maple Street, we stay up on current events. All right, so I'm going to skip ahead so then you meet Clive, who is her father, who is my favorite character. Oh, I lost my place. I think it was chapter 24. Okay, so Clive is her father, who is hallucinating. Has been hallucinating animals, small animals, and they know he's dying. And he has this friendship with the ghost, Ernest Harold Baines, who was a Dr. Dolittle type who lived at the edge of this park. And he had wild animals living in his house. And his whole life, he was born with this sort of magic ability to communicate with animals. Like when he was a kid, he would always get in trouble for having like a hedgehog in his pocket at boarding school. And then his whole life, he had this not only ability with animals, but with people. Like he would speak without a microphone to a room of 400 children, and you could hear a pin drop. So there's all these and I'll tell you more later about him. But I just stumbled upon him, and there's all this like mythology about him and his life. And he lived with his wife at the edge of this park. She also apparently had a talent with animals because they also seemed to live with her. But he was, I guess, I don't know if you need to know this in the scene, I forget, but he was also a womanizer, which I learned through my research, and he doesn't write about. And I was able to include, because all of his work is in public domain and his photographs, so there's pictures throughout. There's little sections which are written which are his writings, although I definitely I used his writings and kind of collaged them and worked with them since they're in public domain, and then added stuff. He never wrote about being a womanizer. That's just the gossip that remains. And so I use that a little bit. So Clive has a friendship with the ghost. And he's cremated, so he's allowed to leave the bounds of the cemetery. So the people in the graveyard have kind of they're annoyed by him. So this is a scene where something happens with Clive and the ghost of Ernest Harold Baines. Clive woke from his afternoon nap to find the ghost of Ernest Harold Baines sitting at the edge of his bed. This was unusual, Clive thought. The ghost had never shown up in his bedroom before. Death must be coming soon. What a lonely thought. Clive bravely dragged himself out of bed anyway and noticed he'd been napping in his undershirt and undies. It was 2 p.m., but he threw on his bathrobe and slippers. He saw no reason to get dressed, with nowhere to be, no classes to teach. Clive and Harold went downstairs with Moses on their heels, and they found the house was empty. Yet again, Moses was the only Starling family member standing guard. In the bright kitchen of the Corbin caretaker's house, Clive poured out an afternoon snack. 3 bowls of cereal, one for him, one for Harold, and one for the fox, in case the ghost of Harold's pet fox finally decided to show up. The ghostly vision Clive had seen only once, standing at the edge of the woods that day, the day Emma had finally come home. Clive knew the fox was the creature that Harold loved most in all the world, but he never came around with Harold. Clive was a little miffed by it. Still, Clive was glad his friend had some company, since Harold said his wife, Louise, wasn't with him in the woods. She went to travel the world after his death, Harold had explained. She'd outlived him by many years. She'd been a successful photographer in Europe and had ended up buried in Nova Scotia. She'd always wanted to be nearer the ocean. It made Clive awfully happy, he still had his own wife, to hear Harold talk about Louise. Clive went to put his cereal bowl in the sink, and he looked out the kitchen window onto the front lawn. There in the midday sunshine was a deer standing in the snow. "I'm sure she'd like a snack too," Harold said. Clive agreed, and he went out with a box of cereal. More corn pops from the starling's endless supply. When Clive extended the yellow puffs to the deer, he felt like he could read her mind. He felt like he knew everything about her. How glad she was to see him. Now, most deer would have run from Clive Starling. He was wearing a bathrobe and an undershirt, and what Clive's students would call tighty-whitey underwear. But this particular deer was remarkably bold and had been fed by children before, had discovered the joys of the packaged foods available on the playground at recess time. The children at Dreamfar Elementary had fed this deer fruit roll-ups and peanut butter sandwiches, carrot sticks, and Ritz crackers, and once a slice of ham. The children had the good sense not to feed the deer any chocolate items, since they knew a chocolate can kill a dog, so it can likely kill a deer too. So this particular deer, whom Clive Starling quickly named Bambi, as though he were a man with no imagination and not a professional poet, ate corn pops straight from Clive's palm. That tickles Bambi, Clive said. The deer had whiskers underneath her jaw. Clive Starling reached into the cereal box again. Boy, did he feel like a friend to all animals at that moment. He was inhabiting the spirit of the noble Harold Baines. If there is only so much life left in this skin, Clive thought, I am glad I've had this experience. And he looked the deer over lovingly. It was only then, he reported to everyone later, that he noticed that the deer was speckled with some kind of pearlescent paint. This deer, his Bambi, had been shot, but only by a paintball gun. Clive had heard about this, why someone would do this. The high school kids were into night hunting or flashlight hunting, which is illegal because a deer will freeze when you shine a light at it, and that unfair advantage makes it poaching, not hunting. The high schoolers had started shooting deer up with glow-in-the-dark paint in the hopes that they wouldn't have to use flashlights to find the deer at night. Let's get you cleaned up, Clive said to Bambi. I'll get a wet towel. And then Clive realized this was the ultimate test. Ernest Harold Baines had not only fed wild animals, he had lived with them, invited them into his home. Clive Starling did not stop to think of any of the consequences, what his wife might say. Clive Starling didn't think of his wife at all as he lured the deer into the house, one corn pop after the next corn pop. He walked backwards, and soon they were up the 4 porch stairs. Bambi took the stairs one by one, like she'd been walking stairs her whole life, and soon they were in the house. Poor Moses ran upstairs to hide. Clive and the deer were in the front hall. Then they were in the kitchen. Bambi was standing in the kitchen. Bambi's back was as tall as the countertops. It struck Clive then how large this animal was and how hooved. What the heck do I do now, Harold? Clive asked the ghost, but the ghost was not around. Ernest Harold Baines was no longer at the kitchen table, and even Moses was nowhere to be seen. And then Clive remembered he had to wash the paint off the deer. He poured the remaining cereal into a bowl and left Bambi munching away as he went upstairs to get a towel and some paint-removing supplies. In the bathroom cabinet upstairs, Clive found the thing he was looking for, nail polish remover with acetone. He knew this was the best thing to remove paint quickly. His wife had taught him that much. He splashed acetone onto the towel and went downstairs toward the deer, the open bottle in one hand, the towel in the other. He wanted to clean her up quickly while he still had cereal left to feed her. It might have all worked out fine, but Bambi had lived long enough to associate certain smells with fear and otherwise bad feelings. What Clive Starling did not know, because he was not a gunman, had never been a gunman, was that acetone is often used in a homemade mixture to clean your gun. Many hunters in New Hampshire used a homemade mixture, and Bambi knew the smell of acetone. Clive could tell as soon as he was face to face with her again what she was thinking and that he'd made a major mistake. In the sunny yellow kitchen of the caretaker's house of the Corbin mansion, Bambi went berserk. I'm going to read a couple, just 3 more pages that I have never read before. I never get to read it because I never have the time. But this is something that will be, people are always curious. I'm always curious about other writers, what comes from real life, especially people who write like wacky books like mine. And so this comes from a real story of something that happened to my uncle. So it's just 1 chapter later. The next chapter is just the fallout after after, the whole family gets to the house, has realized that the house that they actually don't own, that they rent from the guy who owns the mansion, they rent the caretaker's house, has been destroyed by the deer. And the man who owns the house is also the man who owns the gun factory, the mansion. And he's like a father figure to the mother. So she's completely hysterical because she feels like she's let him down. She blames herself for there being a deer in the house. So this is what happens after that. They're going to tell him because they're worried otherwise that it will get through the grapevine. Small town, gossip passes quickly, so people are going to find out very quickly that there's been a deer in the house, and she wants to be the one to tell this man, Ralph Kelsey, before anyone else gets to. So it's three pages. By the time Emma and her mother got to the car to head to Sundown Acres Assisted Living, Ingrid was in hysterics. She was terrified to tell Ralph that his house had been wrecked. She didn't want to disappoint him, she said. It was a side of her mother that Emma had never seen before. She was usually cool and composed, even if sometimes she'd snap, throw plates at the wall. But she never showed weakness like this, never showed fear. Mom, Ralph will understand, Emma attempted to reassure her. It was an accident, and he has the mansion and the apartment in Sundown Acres. He even has that little hunting cabin he never goes to. It's not like he needs the caretaker's house. I hope he hasn't heard what happened yet. Can you drive a little faster? We should be the ones to tell him. We're almost there, Emma told her. Mom, calm down. See if you can calm down. Sundown Acres Assisted Living was only 3 miles from the Corbin mansion, but it was possible that Ralph had already heard about what had happened. In such a small town, and with something as big as a deer in the house, that news would travel fast. And knowing the Sundown Acres gossip grapevine, Ralph was sure to hear it in the wrong way. The gossip at Sundown Acres Living was like a game of telephone. Many of the residents couldn't hear very well, but they all loved to gossip, so they would pass the half-heard news on, and by the time the last person heard it, it barely resembled the original information. When Emma and her mother pulled up outside the entrance to Sundown Acres, there was an ambulance out front, a sight at any assisted living home. Oh dear, Ingrid said. Emma knew her mother wasn't trying to be funny about Bambi. It was her honest reaction to the ambulance. The red lights were turned off, and no one was rushing around, which meant that the person they'd called to save was now someone already dead. When Emma and Ingrid walked into Sundown Acres, everything was still chaos, since Ralph Kelsey had been dead for just over an hour. Officer Jean was taking notes. He was the nicer cop, short and shaped like a guinea pig. The police investigation was underway, but Officer Jean said he could tell the Starlings most of the story. Ingrid was listed as Ralph's emergency contact. She was his legal caretaker, which Emma had never known before. About 2 hours before, Angus Daggett had been the first resident at Sundown Acres to hear that there was a deer in the Corbin mansion, or that huge yellow house on Corbin Road, as Angus's son had told him over the phone. Angus Daggett's son was 44-year-old Angus Daggett Jr. and was known as Gus Gus to just about everyone, one of those silly childhood nicknames that had stuck. Gus Gus was in the volunteer fire department, and he called his father to explain why he wasn't coming by Sundown Acres until later. He called from the fire truck and told me about the deer, Angus Daggett had explained to Officer Jean. Gus Gus had come to give a statement too, and he said that he'd told his dad that he couldn't come golfing today, that his help was needed, but he'd be by to visit before dinner. I said I'd call when I was in the lobby and we'd have a few fingers of Maker's Mark together. It was my dad's birthday today, Gus Gus explained. I didn't want him to think I'd forgotten, so I called him on the way to to the deer. Angus Daggett was one of the residents who didn't hear very well, but who suffered from such terribly good confidence that he thought he heard just fine. Emma remembered him from years ago, from volunteering at Sundown. He was the kind who pinched butts. When Angus Daggett had heard his son on the phone was half correct. He heard that there was a deer in the Corbin mansion trapped upstairs, and it was really the caretaker's house, not the mansion, but that's close enough. Angus had also heard his son say that they needed his help to shoot it. Gus Gus said he would be by soon to pick him up. He was on the way in the fire truck, and he'd call when he was in the lobby. Angus was sure his son had said they needed a couple of trigger marksmen, which Angus Daggett had been at one point. He'd been a sniper in World War II. Here was a chance to be a hero again, Angus Daggett told Officer Jean. Do you know how bored I've been here? A chance to be a hero along his son Gus Gus. He wasn't sure why one deer needed 2 marksmen, but Angus Daggett knew something about the Corbin mansion. He'd heard about it enough from his friend Ralph Kelsey, who owned the place and had never shut up about the history of it. I never knew why he didn't keep living there and hire full-time help, Angus said. Angus was quoted as saying in the police notes. He could certainly afford it, and his daughter and her family live right next door. When her mother read that quote, Angus saw that it just about killed her, because they both knew that Angus Daggett was one of Ralph Kelsey's best friends at Sundown Acres, but Angus was confused. Ralph didn't have a daughter. Ralph didn't have any family left. His wife had died so many years ago, but Ralph did have the Starlings next door. He had Ingrid and Clive and Emma and Augie, and they had him. Emma realized that Officer Jean probably thought they were Ralph's family, that he was her healthcare proxy, that her mom wasn't just his healthcare proxy, which is why they were getting the entire story of his death. Well, they were family, just not tied together by blood. I know this is a lot, Officer Jean said at that point, stroking his round face with a look of serious concern. Would you like me to stop for now? No, Ingrid said, wiping away some tears. Go on. More excited than he had been in decades, Angus Daggett went downstairs to tell Ralph Kelsey the news. That there was a deer stuck in Ralph's house, and Angus said, isn't that strange, and that he hoped the doe wouldn't do much damage. Angus bragged to his friend that he was being called in as an expert marksman, and he assured Ralph that he didn't have much to worry about. The deer will be dead in no time, as soon as my son comes to pick me up in the fire truck. And what was his reaction? Ingrid said. What did Ralph say about the deer? According to Angus, Ralph laughed his ass off, Officer Jean said. He laughed so hard he said he was going to wet his pants. Emma could see her mom's face react. Ralph wasn't mad about at her in his last moments. Angus Daggett had gone back upstairs, furious and humiliated by Ralph's laughter, and he took out his gun. And he sat down at the edge of his lazy boy chair to wait for his son to call. He took out his cleaning solution, the stuff that smelled something like acetone nail polish remover, and he began to clean his gun. And then, I don't know how it happened, but it went off in my hands, and then, Angus Daggett explained. In parentheses, the police report read, at this point, Mr. Daggett begins to cry and could not finish his sentence. The gunshot went right through the floor and right into the identical apartment below and straight through the identical brown lazy boy chair that came with the deluxe retirement package. But first, the bullet went through the chest of Mr. Ralph Kelsey. He'd had to lie down for a moment, tired out from that last good laugh. So my uncle did not get shot through the chest, but he did get up to make himself a Jack and Coke just in time to not get shot through the chest. His lazy boy chair got cut. So that was the true story that inspired the that scene in the book. So.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephanie.
We have time for some questions. I have a few to lob if, well, you guys get warmed up. Here's one. All right.
So you've talked on your Bedlows podcast about sort of your revision process and how much the book changed from the time that you sold it to your publisher, from the time that it came out. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how it changed or what changed, or like how much of it is different from what you sold versus what we've read.
I'm just going to repeat that question for the recording, but as I understood it, you said your book changed a lot after it was accepted for publication, and you'd like to know more about that process, right?
Cool. Yeah, I will take you through the whole revision process because this, from before I sold it and then after I sold it, so it was, this book was, you got a little taste of it and the ground it covers. I wanted to write a story I started writing a story that was about a young woman who had a slight magic healing touch, who loses it, but comes home and like could really use the healing touch at this point in her life. I wanted to set it in a small town. I didn't have a particular small town in mind. We spent a lot of time in New Hampshire growing up. So I often set things in New Hampshire because it's so much of what I associate with childhood, and some of my imagination is like triggered by childhood memories, even though I don't always write about I do write about kids a lot. But so I was writing this. Second books are famously hard to write. People always, every writer like complains about how awful they are. And that's for like a lot of reasons. You want to make the people that you made happy in the first one happy again. You want to prove the people that said something negative about you wrong. You know, there's all sorts of like, you just have a sense of your writing in the world, and it changes your relationship, which is a very personal relationship to writing. And I was also just kind of, depressed at that time in my life for unrelated reasons, mostly because my beloved dog had died. So I was having a hard time. I was writing this story, and I wanted to write about this woman who moves to a small town and becomes a teacher. Then I was visiting my friends in Newport, New Hampshire, and came across, and we were driving around. They had just moved. They had bought a cabin up there, so we were buying a Christmas tree. So we were just driving around looking at the town, and Newport, New Hampshire. Has anyone been there? Some people have, yeah. It's a nice town, but it's, kind of like this, like lots of forests, lots of woods, covered bridges, like a small town center with a McDonald's and a white steepled church and a gazebo. And it's the New England town, not a place where there's huge mansions. But we looked up and there's this hill, and on the top of the hill was this beautiful yellow mansion, which looks like the nicest hotel you've ever seen or been to. And so I was like, can we go there? Is that a spa? Like, where are we? And because it's like hidden by the woods, it just looks so magical on the up the hill. But then there's no trespassing signs at the base of the driveway. And so I was so interested because I was like, a person, that's privately owned. That's someone's house. And my friends didn't know what it was. So I went home and Googled Newport, New Hampshire, huge yellow mansion. And that's when I found out about Austin Corbin, the Gilded Age millionaire who had moved there. And then the legend has it that he knocked down, he went out and made millions he was president of the Long Island Railroad. He is not famous, but he was kind of a Vanderbilt, like they called him at the time the father of American banking. Like he played a part in like railroads and banking and coal and made millions in many ways. But so moves up to the town he was born in to retire there. And the legend has it that he knocked down the house he was born in, except for the room he was born in, like his childhood bedroom, which I just think is so weird and creepy. And then builds this huge mansion around it. And the mansion is still there today. So I'm interested now. And then I find out, keep reading, and he bought up 26,000 acres at like 60 farms and forced some of the farmers who didn't want to leave off the land, bought them out, and fenced it all in and made just this enormous hunting park. And shipped in animals from all over the world. At the time, white-tailed deer had been hunted out of New England. And, that seems wild. I have white-tailed deer in my yard almost every morning. But the whole town showed up when the deer came on rail car because it was like, we need to see this exotic animal. And they also had antelope and lots of like pheasants and wild boar. And so I'm reading about this. I love animals. Animals are a big like part of my creative life, as anyone who's read any of my work knows. So I'm so interested now, but I don't know what to do with it because I don't write historical fiction. Now maybe you have a sense of my sense of humor. So I'm not sure I like historical fiction a lot, but it wouldn't, I don't think, fit with my writing style that well. I would have to really pivot. And also, I'm at the point where I want to make Rabbit Cake readers, my first book, happy. So that's part of what I'm thinking, although I want to do something different too. So that, and then I go to the Historical Society in this town, and that's when I find out about Ernest Harold Baines and see all his photographs and just read all his books. I got all his books off eBay because they're like long out of print, and see all the photographs, and then start spending time with the historians in town. So at that point, it became a really different book. And expanded in these really exciting ways, and also became fun again because I was doing something that I hadn't done with my first one. I was interacting with the historians in the town, and I after I had gone from the Historical Society, I went to the library in town, and there's a couple of, because the park is so big. Oh, it's still intact today. I always forget to say that. It's still intact today. This says in the book, but it's owned by 25 anonymous millionaires, and everyone has like a parcel of land, and it's still now it's super secretive. So so then it's become, okay, maybe this could be part of my 2014 book because it's still there. And it's just like someone in the town called it a black hole in his backyard, because even people who live in the town, have lived there all their lives, don't get invited in. There is no like all town day where everyone gets to go in the gates. It's just this sort of secret place. And there's a great NPR outside New Hampshire story, which is worth Googling. Just Google the Millionaires Hunt Club if you want to just listen to a cool NPR story about this journalist who has an impossible time getting into the park. So that became a different story once I knew about Ernest Harold Baines. And that's when I was at the library, and I asked the librarian, do you know anything about Ernest Harold Baines? Because she was also a historian. And she's like, oh, I think I have a picture of him somewhere. And then someone across the library from me, just a man who was sitting there, said, oh, he was quite the womanizer. And I love that because it was, this man died in 1925, but it was just like the gossip had remained. Like it was like I was talking about Dirty Harry down the street, it was just so funny to me, and made me like know that I had to write about him because he became a real person to me in that moment rather than just the mythical figure of the man who lived with the animals. So the research component really changed it. And then I wrote a full draft. And as I said, I was inspired by John Irving. I do believe one of my mantras for people who are writing a novel for the first time, or like whether it's your first novel or many novels, is just it's something that Terry Pratchett said, which is all your first draft is you're just telling yourself the story. So I wrote the whole thing. You had to get the plot out, and that for me means writing one page after the next, and just like as though I'm telling myself a sort of bedtime story. And that keeps myself amused in it. It keeps myself like I write first to make myself laugh, or to work out things that I haven't solved yet, or to find a way to, as the armchair lazy boy story, like find a way to use something that happened in real life, but in a story way, something that not just a random event, but stories are always dominoes, that this thing causes the next thing. So I wrote the first draft, and then I had a fellowship at MacDowell, where I had a month to myself. It was before I had a kid, a month to myself just to work. And at that point, I had a friend who had said, this is written in this third person omniscient, but there's so much humor in the voice of the narrator, like who is talking? And I had said, Lucas, I don't care. I wasn't ready to deal with that sort of problem. But then I was like, this person who is telling the story really has, but it's omniscient. So it's someone, I don't walk around with omniscience. I don't know what you guys are thinking right now. I hope you're having a good time. But I didn't know who could be telling the story. And I get to MacDowell, and MacDowell is an artist colony that's been around for a long time. A lot of you probably know it. And a lot of very famous people have worked there, written there, created art there of different kinds. And so the first day you get there, they're kind of like, we're putting you up for a month. Don't waste our time. Why did we pick you? Here are all the famous people. Here's the James Baldwin Library. So I'm kind of like, and I'm also pregnant, so I feel like the clock is ticking in so many ways, like I'm just running out of time. And then I realized that Thornton Wilder wrote Our Town at MacDowell, and that the cemetery is right down the street. And I'm trying to tie it together, the original story I'm telling, 2014 story, with Ernest Harold Baines was already a ghost, because I had to make him a ghost. So I'm trying to tie these two time periods together that I'm obsessed with, but it's like, how do I get the reader to also take the tuna and the chocolate and put them together? How am I? So once the Our Town really key unlocked for me, like the ghost, of course, the ghost in the cemetery care about both those time periods. So that was the first, that was another major revision. I revised like hundreds of times. So to ask me a question about revision, you're getting a long answer. So then I did that, and then it did sell about, after I had a kid, I kept editing. I edited with, I started editing again when she was 10 days old. So I worked on it when she was really small. And then we sold it when she was 6 months old. And I thought I was like, home free, freedom ring. And then the pandemic hit 2 months later, and my babysitter went away. So I worked on it. And it went to auction, and there were some people that didn't want to change a thing. But the one I went with wanted to change some significant things. And I love editing, so I definitely wanted to go with someone who wanted to change significant things, even though my agent was like, it's perfect, I wouldn't change a thing, because she had edited it with me, so then she's got her own opinions. But this book is so much like a sweater that if you pull one thread, which is really different from my first book, I could really change things because so much of it was at the voice. It didn't matter necessarily what happens. That's a story of healing, but this is so plot, like the plot had to be so tight in order for everything to work. So for her to say we're going to change anything, it's like, well, now the sweater falls apart and I have to start all over again. And so I went through just this process of revising, which was, taking things out, like, it's not so interesting in terms of like what I took out and what I put in, because I don't remember. But it was, writing this novel, revising this novel, we started editing in March 2020. So I was like, how do I write this zany comic book about death, basically, in March 2020? So the first 2 times we edited, I just messed it up so bad. She was like, what happened to the book that I loved? You were just destroying it for a couple months? Good for you. So it took me a while. So we ended up moving the book back, and then she had given me some edits, but then finally she was just like, this book is a book that you need to solve on your own. I'm just going to leave you alone for 6 months and you figure it out. And at that point I started getting up, I had no childcare, so I started getting up at like 3:30 or 4 in the morning to work by myself on it. And then I figured it out, but that's the simple, non-simple answer.
Her notes at the back of the novel are fabulous about her research. I mean, that's worth the price of admission right there. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you were talking about thinking about your second novel and trying to kind of please fans of your first novel.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just about to query it. My first novel is starting to think about ideas, and the second one is really different.
Yeah.
And I've heard that there's pressure to kind of do a similar thing and kind of stay in the same lane. And I'm wondering if you found that from your agent or your editor or anyone.
So the question for the machine here is, in between the first and second novel, the writing, is there pressure, and correct me if I'm wrong, is there pressure to do the same thing over again and keep pleasing the same people? Is that?
Or at least similar.
Yeah.
Similar.
I would say it depends. If you first, there is definitely like marketing people will tell you certain they want you to build a brand, right? But how useful is that? I don't know. Like some of it is learning your strengths as a writer, I think, and like also finding out what makes you happy. I wouldn't be happy writing historical fiction. My books are really different. This one is much more like, they're the same and they're totally different, I guess so it is nice if there's things that, your fans of your first book will recognize things in your second. There are people that love Unlikely Animals that hate Rabbit Cake. Ideally you don't want to go the opposite direction. There probably are people who love Rabbit Cake and hate Unlikely Animals, but I haven't read about it. I think it's about keeping yourself interested. So you know how hard it is to write and make yourself sit down to write. So for me, I wanted to do something new, and I wanted to write a book that was like just bigger and span more, like just because I thought that would really both challenge me, but also I was I may never write a voice as strong as the first person narrator, I think, and it's about a 12-year-old girl named Elvis, and she just has this really strong voice, and her voice was always crystal clear in my head. So I had to get away from that first person voice because I was otherwise maybe gonna either write her voice again or write like a lesser first person. So I knew I needed to write what I thought originally was going to be just a third person omniscient, and then it changed. But I wouldn't at this stage, well, really any stage, I wouldn't let that get in your head too much and just write what calls you to write, because you never know what's going to happen in terms of, and the books may end up talking to each other in ways that you're not aware of. So I wouldn't let that. I don't think that's really useful for any artist to think about as marketing too much.
So we have time for one more question. Anyone else? Can you talk a little bit about Ernest Harold Baines?
Yeah, so Ernest Harold Baines, as I said, and you can flip through the book, there's his pictures are in there, so they're all his real pictures that his wife took. This is him and his fox. He also lived with a bear and wolves and birds. He had a bear, Jimmy the bear. So Jimmy's in the book. So I was able to take his, all in the public domain. So I'm able to take sections of him. As you get to know him, there's just sections that mark the book is divided into like a different 7 sections. And so at the beginning of every section, you get a little taste of Ernest Harold Baines' writing, just like three pages of what I took his writing, and then basically I would write down the story. So everything that happens, the animals really did those things that they do in the book, but I would do like an erasure poem and because he would sometimes just be too long-winded, and I would condense it, and then I would edit it a little bit. Sometimes I had to change. He had a maid, Lucy. Sometimes I had to change Lucy to his wife because so much of the book is about the marriage, both the marriage, that Clive and Ingrid's marriage, and then his marriage mirrors theirs a little bit. So I had to change things like that. But everything that the animals do, they really did. That's fun. And then I had to put in a little bit. He doesn't really admit about the womanizing, but he alludes to it a couple times. It's enough that a modern reader gets what he's talking about, that he says, he's out on the road and comes home with mud cake boots. And the research with him was so fun and so rewarding, and became friends with a lot of the historians up there. But it was interesting to go up there and say, I'm writing a book, but it's going to be super weird. So I'm going to take the real town stuff and I'm going to really scramble it. And I was able to go back to Newport, and the librarian put together this amazing event where she got the gun factory. So the really is the town, the main Strum and Ruger. There's the gun factory that's there, and that's so the guy that owns, originally I just guessed because I had to have someone, Ralph Kelsey, the character he's a minor character, but yeah, I did spoil it that he does get killed in the middle of the book. I made Ralph Kelsey. Originally, he was called Chicken Shit Ralph because I just like thought that was funny, and made him own the gun factory. And then because I needed someone who could afford that mansion, and then I found out that really the guy who owns the gun factory did own the mansion. So I met with him, and he talked with me about Ernest Harold Baines, and he was also a member of the Hunt Club. He had gone home. He was suffering from terminal cancer, and he died like 6 weeks after we met. And he was, so I did have to change the character. Ralph Kelsey is a very, very lovable character, so you couldn't really sue me for much. But I was like, we'll not call him Chicken Shit Ralph, since everyone's going to think I'm really writing about him. But it was just a total coincidence. And he was like a very well-known member of the town because he was, I mean, the gun factory is like the biggest employer, and the mansion is very something to look at. If you're ever like looking to take a drive and just want to go look at a huge mansion, it's worth it. It's next to Google Corbin Bridge, the covered bridge that takes you right to the base of the mansion.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.